Welcome to another episode of the MEGIN Spotlight series. Today we are delighted to welcome Ken Lininger. We were introduced to Ken by our wonderful advocacy group partner Monica Jones at the Brain Recovery Project. Ken has kindly agreed to share his caregiver's perspective on his daughter's epilepsy diagnosis and epilepsy surgery's journey with us. Hi Ken, how are you?
Good morning, how are you? I'm good.
Thank you. Let's start with the first question then. Can you provide an introduction to your daughter's epilepsy journey? How old was she when diagnosed and what type of epilepsy did she have?
She was, well, first of all, Savannah was a twin and they were born at 36 weeks, gestational period, a little bit soon, a little bit early, but not early enough to where anybody was concerned. She had a C-section birth and she had APGAR scores of 5-7, which isn't great, but it wasn't anything of concern to the doctors initially. Everything seemed normal for the first 4 to 6 weeks. Then we noticed episodes. And great thing about technology is we were able to catch a lot of those episodes on cell phone video. And Savannah was very predictable with her episodes, so my wife kind of knew right when it was going to happen. Showed those to the pediatrician. He was concerned but not alarmed. And excuse me, one of the visits to the pediatrician, Savannah actually had a seizure in the room with the pediatrician. So when he saw it, he immediately referred her to the local children's hospital where we were. That's typically not how it goes here. Typically you get referred to a neurologist and it's a longer process. In the emergency room, well, getting ahead of myself, this was around 7 weeks. She was about 7 weeks old at that point. And then the official diagnosis came about 8 weeks. But honestly, she was showing signs around 6 to 8 weeks old, 7 weeks old, where she was obviously having seizures, obviously regressing. We just didn't realize everything at the time.
So when you went to the Children's Hospital of Orange County in Southern California, what diagnostic testing did this care team perform to diagnose the type of epilepsy your daughter had?
Yes, so once we were in the emergency room, the attending physician at the time, the attending neurologist, happened to be a leading pediatric epileptologist. Her name was Dr. Mary Zupont, and she was phenomenal. She took Savannah and admitted her immediately for inpatient monitoring. So her first EEG was a 36-hour long-term monitor, video EEG. We did a MRI the next day. We did lumbar puncture and they pulled a lot of CSP and apparently did a lot of metabolic and genetic testing from that material. Those were the primary tests that we did initially to diagnose Savannah. On the third day that we were there after the ER, after entrance to the ER on the third day, Dr. Zupont said that Savannah had infantile spasms, otherwise known as West syndrome. And in addition to that, she was having a lot of partial activity, meaning activity that was not necessarily related to the West syndrome, but only in one side of her brain. So that was her initial diagnosis.
And then shortly after your daughter's diagnosis, you moved states. And how did you navigate selecting a new epilepsy care team for your daughter, which must have been quite worrying at the time? And were you able to hand over or coordinate with between your original team and the new team at, I believe it was Memorial Hermann?
Correct. Right. So once Savannah was diagnosed, things went downhill more and quickly, and it became evident that she needed a lot more full-time care. We had 2 other kids, well, plus the twin brother, so that was 3 other kids, and that was a lot of management. So what we realized, or what we decided to do was pull back and have one of us parents be full-time at home directing Savannah's care. And we had experienced a little bit of a honeymoon period. Her first treatment was ACTH. We added on vigabatrin shortly thereafter. That seemed to get the IS under control. The partial activity was still there. We had a little bit of a honeymoon, and we decided to make the move from Southern California to Texas. It was a matrix of a decision. It wasn't something we took lightly. We consulted Dr. Zuponce several times on the kind of facility Savannah needed, the kind of care she needed, and she directed us to, we found Memorial Hermann, and she definitely gave it her blessing, if you will. And the way we made the connection was I searched for, it's a teaching hospital. I searched and found the doctor's email in the school side of on the medical school side. I emailed the doctor directly. This is Dr. Gretchen von Allman. We made the connection very quickly. She set us up with her staff. We were fortunate in that we liked to collect the medical records. So everything that Savannah had done, we had copies of, so we were able to bring it very quickly. But in the end, the hospitals communicated with each other and the records were moved. It was a big step, I think, for Dr. von Allman to take Savannah in, because there's a lot of information. We showed up with a book as thick as a Bible with tests, notes, reports, things that they had to disseminate and start from zero, just like the other doctors did. So it took a while. It took 3 or 4 months for them to kind of navigate that and get us into their system, if you will. And once there, Savannah started to experience more seizures. So we then went on with more rounds of testing and diagnostics. So
were there any differences in this new hospital's offerings and an approach to where you were before? What was the difference?
The difference, there was 2 differences, I think, at that point, right? First, Savannah had grown, so there was more acute, there was more ability for the doctors to look at her brain a little more closely with more development. Second, this hospital had 2 MEG scanners, 2 MEG labs, and that was probably the biggest difference between the 2 facilities, is having that modality to measure and evaluate what's going on inside of Savannah, inside of her brain. And that proved to be pivotal in changing the course of her journey with epilepsy.
So your daughter's case is quite unique to many others that we hear of, in that she had her first epilepsy surgery relatively quickly after diagnosis, which we'll come to in a minute, I suspect. But why was epilepsy surgery considered so soon? And what testing was done to qualify her as a surgical candidate? And ultimately, what made you decide to move forward with this?
Right. So, well, I think number one, it goes back to the doctors, the physicians. They had a much broader picture of, what's the best course of action for these young children. These were pediatric epileptologists, not adult neurologists. And I think both of them, Mary Zuponce told us at day 10, before we had moved to California, that she most likely later in her life is going to benefit from either hemispherectomy or what we call a TOP, or a POT, temporal occipital parietal resection. So we knew that we had that knowledge very early going into her journey. As we moved to Texas, we also knew that. And when you have a doctor that's thinking that way, I think to start with, you end up in a better place long term. It is very unfortunate, I think, to hear and see doctors think in this world that surgery should be a last resort and we should exhaust every drug possible before we consider surgery. By definition, Savannah had failed 2 medical trials, optimum at the target dose, and she still was having epilepsy. So by definition, she's a surgical candidate when you look at the International League Against Epilepsy, their guidelines. Now, to determine how good of a candidate she is, you need to go through all the testing, right? And so that's where we were. We had doctors, I think, that really understood that at a higher level than most. And so having the technology we had at Memorial Hermann with the MEG scanner and a 3T MRI and the team around this technology is what made the difference. And being able to look across all the modalities, PET scan, MRI, EEG, and then adding in the MEG, it just gives you a much more clear picture. At least it did in our case. It may not in every case, but it did in our case of what might best help Savannah. So
your daughter actually had 2 surgeries. So following the first surgery, how was your daughter after the first, and what led to making that decision around having second epilepsy surgery then?
Yeah, so when we did the first surgery, Savannah was very sick. She was seizing a lot. We were continuing to add medication to try to control it. And when we did the first MEG, this was at a time when there was a lot of pushback against using anesthesia or anything that would put the kids to sleep, because they were realizing, they had a lot of test failure. They had a lot of interference. They had a lot of data that's not good. So with Savannah being very predictable with how she was going to seize, in the MEG scanner, I was able to wake her up, and she actually experienced a clinical seizure. So they had a very clear picture in the MEG scanner with EEG where the onset and the offset was. And so when we did the first surgery, the doctors had a very clear picture of where they were going. How far they were going to go, I think, was unclear. And then Savannah at the time, unfortunately, was kind of sick. She just was sedentary, just a lot of fluid, just a lot of yuck. And so when we left the first surgery, when Savannah came out of the first surgery, the doctors definitely felt like she's probably going to need more surgery in the future. They just weren't able to time-wise do it at that moment, because she just wasn't that healthy on the table. In recovery, you would have never known that, because we literally left the hospital 20 hours later. I mean, it was just amazing. It's like the child held a bottle on her own. She was feeding herself, doing all the things she needed to do. She was smiling. It was quite amazing. It was a transformation. It's like she woke up. It's almost like we met her for the second time. So that's how the first surgery went.
And so the second surgery then, was MEG scan used again for that prior to that surgery as well?
Yes, it was. And it went well. I don't think it provided them any remarkable information. It was very supportive and coincident with what we had done before, that she needed she needed a larger resection. She was 13 months old. And, oftentimes you'll read in the literature, that small resections don't work with very young kids. And I think it's a generalized statement. You never know. But in her case, she had a very diffuse, a very broad dysplasia. And that was clear. It was clear in the pathological findings. It was clear in the MEG findings. The surgery just needed to be a little bit larger to collect and mitigate all of the tissue causing the epilepsy. So we definitely used it. It was helpful, and we moved forward with surgery.
So what was your daughter's experience of having an MEG scan compared to other imaging modalities that I'm sure you've had to use as well for this?
Well, it's young kids are very difficult, right? You're trying to get them to be still. Good luck with a 12-month-old. It's very hard, very difficult to get them to be still, right? So the MagLab, a lot of times they like to run coincident EEG, right? So you're putting a lot of stuff on these little kids, and they need to hold still, despite the technology that that the scanners can move and track the head movement. Trying to get them to hold still is hard. It was a lot like an MRI. You're trying to keep them up all night the night before to get them to sleep naturally, right? They were doing general anesthesia for these not much before us, maybe a year before us, and then they stopped. They didn't want to do that anymore. And so then it's kind of up to the parents to figure out, literally, how do we calm this kid down, right? I mean, it's quite an experience. It's a metal box inside of a room, and you go in there, and it's very different. It's a very different experience. I know it's not like that for all, but I would say, aside from the frustration of dealing with young children, I mean, it's painless. It's not really an invasive test. Not as invasive as EEG in terms of all the leads, but very interesting. I personally found it very interesting. Dr. Michael Funke runs the MagLab there at Memorial Hermann, and the whole team was just very nice. I mean, we got to go in the back and just kind of see what they were doing and how they were monitoring all the squids and seeing the output. It was very neat. I liked it.
That's good.
So.
And then post-surgery, sort of second surgery, what was the recovery process like? I mean, how did your care plan sort of evolve from there?
Right. So the second surgery was definitely harder. She just didn't snap out of it, if you will, as quickly. A lot more frustration and protest, as they say, from the child. She just wasn't very happy, and why, I don't know. We did a pretty large surgery. So at that second surgery, it was a complete anatomical removal of the temporal, occipital, and parietal lobes. So she's missing quite a bit of organ tissue at that point. And they went right up to the line on the motor strip. So she had a lot of weakness on one side, which eventually dissipated. And it took a good 3 months, I think, for her to kind of regulate and figure the world out. I think, when you do these surgeries on these children, whether you're disconnecting or removing, it's a mechanical control of the epilepsy, and it's immediate, like from 1 minute to the next. It's not a drug, creating a change in the brain. I mean, you literally disconnected it or removed it, either way. And I think the kids, it just felt to us like it took her a long time to kind of regulate and just sort of figure out what's going on. So beyond that, beyond the acute period there, the discontinuation of the medication, was our goal, was to try to stop that. And we did. About a year later, she was done with the medication. So, and that, between the surgery and between being able to discontinue the medication, she really, Savannah was really able to, I think, experience the best possible life she could. Right.
So what advice would you give then people with drug-resistant epilepsy now?
Right. So obviously we can't give any medical advice, but what I would recommend is that they need to advocate for their child. They need to understand, and you have to take a step back, I think, as a parent, when this happens. And what I mean by that is, most of us don't know about this entire alternate world universe that's going around the world, going around the earth with us, right? This universe of epilepsy. We don't realize that it's out there. And so you have to take a step back and really educate yourself on what is possible out there. And there's a whole bunch of drugs, and for the vast majority of people with epilepsy, that can work. But as soon as you reach that point where it's not working, my recommendation would be you have to be aggressive. You got to go out there and find what we call a level 4 center here in the US. And it's, I think, similar in other parts of the world in terms of how they talk about it, but you have to find a center with doctors that perform these surgeries on a regular basis on young children and adults, for that matter. Because if you don't, if you choose to wait, time can be not your friend. Time is not your friend, and when the time goes by, you can't get that back. And you can always try another medication, diet, whatever else is out there, but you can't get the time back. And so if you find a doctor in a group, a medical group that's really aggressive about treating these epilepsies in children, young children, you're going to find that time to surgery is a lot shorter. It's still high in many cases, but it's a lot shorter. It's not 15 years.
Yeah.
And the sooner you can be sure or have a good feeling, a good outlook from a surgical perspective, the sooner you can do that, the better for your child, right? And I think every doctor would tell you that.
So you've also been an advocate for epilepsy awareness and supporting this advancement of epilepsy treatments for a while, obviously, since you've gone through this journey with Savannah. Can you tell our audience what groups you're involved in and why you decided to work with these groups, for example? Just for our audience.
Yeah, so, right. So here in the US, we definitely have a lot of epilepsy awareness type groups. And, locally we have the Epilepsy Foundation of Texas, and then we have the Epilepsy Foundation, it's the US, the more broad picture. And they support all people with epilepsy. But, excuse me, our calling definitely is awareness for what surgery can do for young children, and then to take it a step further, once you've done the surgery, then what? How do we help these kids the most? And the Brain Recovery Project, I think, really addresses that second part of it. So oftentimes the doctors, through no fault of their own, and I'm not making a judgment, but oftentimes they're very focused on stopping the epilepsy, stopping the seizures, and that is their focus. And so once they've done that, they're moving on to the next person who needs that same help. They're not sticking with you and figuring out how do you navigate the whole educational process. How do they do later in life? I think the general feeling is well, however they're doing, it's better than they would be doing, if they were having seizures every day, right? So yeah. Let the parents figure that out. So the Brain Recovery Project really addresses what happens after surgery. We do a lot of surgical awareness material, content creation as well, because it is very unfortunate that the time to surgery is still quite long for many. And it doesn't need to be. It doesn't need to be that long oftentimes. And again, I go back to what I said before, repeating myself, but the sooner you can make that decision and then act on it, the better it can be for your child. So, and then this, if it's better for your child, it's usually better for the whole family as well. It's not just the child. So
How is
we're
Savannah?
active. I'm active in supporting that, being an advocate, being a peer supporter, being someone that shares our story publicly, that preaches, what it is that's possible out there, and then helping navigate, what happens after the surgery for these kids. Savannah's in a very unique place. She's very high functioning, but also has a lot of struggles, and so you can put her into regular school and she'll make it, but I don't think we're doing everything that we could do for this cohort of children that are out there. And so that's kind of our mission at this point, is to drive that change.
Yeah, and we definitely want to support that too. That's definitely a common drive. Ken, we've come to the end of our questions today, and I'm really grateful and thank you very much for your time. It's been really informative for our audience, and an honor for us to be able to share your insights from a perspective of a parent and a caregiver to a child with epilepsy. So I look forward to meeting you in Utah. And thank you again.